Okay, for those of you joining, I'm going to get everybody on mute for now so that we don't have the feedback. And if you notice down at the bottom of your toolbar, there's a little chat button. If you expand that, you'll be able to type any questions that you might have in there. And I can always unmute you if you want to talk to one of our presenters today. We only have about 13 of us online, so it shouldn't be a problem to go ahead and unmute you. So don't be afraid to just say, I'd like to talk to Scott or Paul. This is Erin Inman. I'm the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor for the state of Montana. Welcome to what's happening at the crime lab and how will it affect prosecutors. Joining us are Scott Larson, the Toxicology Supervisor for the crime lab, and Paul Shawn, Deputy County Attorney from Yellowstone County. We're going to start off today with Scott talking about what's going on at the crime lab, and then we're going to spend the last half of the webinar with Paul Shawn telling us about a recent case and challenge that he had. And that particular challenge we'll talk about, I'll talk about when I reintroduce Paul, how it's been argued across the country and it's just now reaching Montana. So we'll talk a little bit about the history of that before we get into that. Just a couple of housekeeping items. This is being recorded, and this year the Traffic Safety Resource Prosecutor programs are public information. So this is not a confidential criminal justice information webinar, which means if you want to share information to get a better answer to your questions, I recommend you call myself or Scott or Paul or anybody else you deem appropriate after the webinar so that you can talk freely about that, because this is being recorded. Department of Transportation will have a copy of this webinar. If somebody does put in a Freedom of Information Act request, this would be something that would be readily given to everyone. So I just wanted to have that warning out there ahead of time. Like I said, if you want to talk about a particular case, all of the presenters are happy to talk to you afterwards about that. Also, we are recording this and we will be storing this along with accompanying material on the county attorney website. So if you're not already registered with the Montana County Attorneys Association website, they do have a forum and it's becoming more user-friendly every day. My past webinar of, I think it was December 30th, 2013, on the admissibility of HGN, the materials are up there, and I am mailing them in the mail, a DVD of the actual webinar itself, so you'll be able to listen to that. The materials that were not emailed to you today would be a recording of Paul's case in court. So what you should have are PowerPoints from this webinar, as well as a brief from Yellowstone County from a defense attorney and Paul's response brief. If you don't have any of that, Barb at Inman Training, Barb Watson, my assistant, can get that for you. All you have to do is email her at barb@Inman Training. I'm going to go ahead and type her email in. So if you don't have any of those materials and you'd like them, please email Barb and she will be sure to get those to you. Okay, with that, Scott Larson with the Crime Lab. Would you go ahead and tell us what's new at the Crime Lab and how it's going to affect prosecutors, please?
Sounds good, Erin. Thank you. Can everybody hear me all right? All right.
Yes, we can hear you.
So, like I said, this is Scott Larson, Toxicology Supervisor. My email for anyone that needs that doesn't have that is slarson@mt.gov. So feel free to send me an email or a phone call whenever you need. So I'll get going. The two subjects that I was asked to speak about today was the pathway of evidence through the laboratory. So we'll talk about that a little bit because I think there's been some questions potentially regarding that. And then some small changes that have been put in place in terms of lab policy, some of which, in terms of the uncertainty of measurement reporting, we've tried to kind of get out there in front of that and give as much information as we can, but in case you've missed it, we'll talk about that a little bit. And then kind of your guys' thoughts on the future layouts of reports. I've got a couple ideas that we're working on to try and give you guys more information. So we'll see how that goes. I always start with a little thing about forensic drug testing being it's highly regulated with multiple safeguards built into the system to protect the rights of the individual. And the quality of the results are only as good as the quality of the entire process. Kind of how that process starts is the accessioning process, the having evidence kind of enter our building. Clearly this is the most important part of the legal chain because it verifies where the sample is at all times. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and then clearly once that happens, then we go, the downstream of that is the screening confirmation of those samples and the production of a report, and then the quality control program that we have in place kind of establishes the standards of the lab and kind of provides that oversight to make sure we're doing what we need to be doing. So let's talk a little bit about the accessioning section and the path of evidence. It's really fairly straightforward, but I've been told that maybe not everyone kind of understands how it works. So we receive evidence, either someone will drop it off or usually by mail. We get the packages delivered every day from across the state. These are accepted by evidence technicians. They're logged into our LIMS system, or which is essentially our database. And this is where they're given the unique case number. Every case that comes in, every evidence that comes in as a case receives its case number. It's not necessarily completely open in that section. It's just given the box is given a case number. It's then placed in the secured storage vault fridge. Daily, a toxicology technician will go down and retrieve the evidence, and they'll scan everything's on barcodes, so they'll barcode scan everything out of the secured vault, take them back to our toxicology section, and they will then they will individually itemize each specimen. So we would then open up the box, and if there's 4 blood tubes, create blood tube 1, 2, 3, and 4 under that unique case number. When this process is done, these specimens then go into the fridge, the toxicology fridge, which only we have access to, and these are open during the day when we're working, but then at night these are locked. So even within a very secure building, they're also then padlocked every night. The toxicologists would then, when they need these samples for testing, they will go and use these barcodes to scan the tubes out. So if you're taking blood tube number 1 from a case, they'll remove that, scanned, and this is all then tracked on through our database as part of the chain of custody. So we can always say who has which tube at all times. And then in the end game, we store all of these samples for a minimum of 1 year, unless we get a request from a police or an attorney, prosecuting attorney, or defense attorney in terms of wanting to store those samples for longer. We can put indefinite holds, but normally we get rid of cases after 1 year. So that is kind of my spiel on kind of the evidence transferring through the lab. Does anyone, I don't see any typed questions. So if there's nothing, I will move on to the next part. And if you have a question with that, we can also come back at the end. So the next section.
Scott,
yes.
I'm just going to interrupt real quick. Was that process you just walked through, is anything about that necessarily new, or is that kind of what's been done for a while?
This is what's been done for a long time. This was just somehow the idea of going through this just came up in a conversation. So I just wanted to, in case there was some questions about how the evidence moves through the lab and things like that, I just wanted to cover that.
Thank you.
But yeah, no changes here. This is the system that's been in place for a while. So the next thing the next subject I was going to talk about is fairly new, and this is going to, I've got blood alcohol here only because I'm using this as the example to talk about the larger program change, which is the tracking of the uncertainty of measurement, which has given toxicologists around the country kind of headaches for a couple of years now, worrying about putting a system like this in place. We're happy that we've got our system in place, and it seems to be working fairly well. And I haven't heard really any issues from any prosecutors, so I'll be interested if people kind of have experience dealing with this actually in court. But to start it with, I thought I'd cover just blood alcohol and how we determine those concentrations and what our system looks like, because it might help you with the next couple of slides. So for people that don't know, the method that we use for blood alcohol, and really pretty much at this point every lab in the country uses, is something called headspace gas chromatography. So you'll see this vial on the right-hand side, and this looks very much like what our vial looks like, and we would add a certain amount of internal standard, which is just a volatile substance in a water solution, because all the ethanols, anything with the hydroxyl group, is very goes into water very easily. So we have this solution, and then we would add in 500 microliters of the blood. So here's the liquid portion that will then get mixed and capped, and so we do this for all of our standards, all of our controls, and then all of our casework. We then add it to the instrument, put it in the auto sampler. These samples then get mixed. They get heated to about 60 degrees. Because ethanol is volatile, there's a certain equilibrium, and you can kind of see this. There's basically half of the amount of ethanol is in the headspace, and the other half is in the liquid. We will then inject 1 microliter of just the gas phase, and there'll be a certain amount of ethanol in that, but an equal proportion within the headspace. That gets injected, would get separated out on what's called a column, and that's the gas chromatography phase. And gas chromatography is just the science of separation. So all the different volatiles that we can see, like methanol and ethanol and acetone and isopropanol and acetaldehyde and all the other ones, difluoroethane, will then all have their own retention time, unique retention time. We actually shoot these on 2 different columns, which have slightly different chemistries, so the retention times shift, and that's how we can be sure that there's not some type of background peak that's kind of sneaking in there. So once all these volatiles go through the column, then it hits what's called an FID detector, a flame ionization detector, and those values are recorded, and we run standards, known ethanol standards, that we use to determine the concentration of our unknown samples, the blood samples that we get. We also run our samples in duplicate, and then we report the average. So that's kind of a background of blood alcohol. So the thing that changed here is historically we did not have to perform an uncertainty of measurement. I'm sure in court we probably talked about the fact that people would talk about that there's some amount of uncertainty with measurements, because we would do 2 samples and there'd be a mean. We wouldn't get the same exact answer in these 2 samples, and that's expected. We understood that, and I think most people understood it. But now what we're doing is we're actually tracking and know the exact percent of our variability in these measurements. So as you can see on the top, mathematically it's accepted that no measurement is exactly known. I think that's, like I said, fairly accepted once you kind of think about it. And variables in these measurements are the measuring system, the procedures, the individual performing the test, and what we're doing now is kind of tracking those 3 things. In terms of the measuring system, we have 3 different headspace instruments that we use. So clearly each one's going to be slightly different, even though it's the exact same method on each of those. The procedure, the second item there, we have 3 different sets of pipettes that we use, individual reagents, things like that. So there'll be small, very, very small differences helped us with those. And then we have 3 different individuals that are performing the testing as well. So each one of those is going to have their own style, and any kind of variables with these are very small, but like I said, now they're measured. So now we are able to get what's called a combined uncertainty, and this is calculated so we can kind of fully interpret these results. So the page that you see here is actually our uncertainty of measurement form, what's called our budget. And I just wanted to walk through. So the reason why I'm showing you this here is this would be if we were ever asked to provide with a litigation request our measurement uncertainty. This would be the form that we would submit. And it's just an Excel sheet. We have about 200 of these individual spreadsheets for all of the different drugs that we quantitate. The only thing we report, or only ethanol and parent THC do we put the actual measurement uncertainty on the reports, but for our accreditation reasons, we have to have this budget performed for any drug that we report out of value. So you can see the top, this is ethanol. It has our range, measurement range, our procedure, SOP, has the date we prepared it. Measurement reproducibility, just to let you kind of get you to understand this a little bit, comes from our QA/QC data that we keep and track. So this is just the relative standard deviation from all of hundreds and hundreds of control samples that we run. The relative standard deviation is just basically the distance off from the mean, the deviation from the mean. So we're at 3.4457% here. Line item number 2 is the matrix. That's our internal rule is when we run our samples in duplicate, they have to be plus or minus 5% for them to pass. If they are outside of plus or minus 5%, that sample gets rejected and it gets repeated at a later date. So that's our matrix uncertainty, or matrix variation. Line item number 3 is the uncertainty that comes from our calibrators. So our calibrators are NIST certified, so they're traceable all the way back to the original ethanol source. So there's a certain amount of traceability, or a certain amount of uncertainty within those standards. You can see it's 0.4%, so it's a very small amount, but it's still there. And line item number 4 is our pipette. Like I said earlier, we have 3 different people that do volatiles here at the lab, and so we have 3 different pipettes. So there's a certain acceptability criteria for your percent accuracy with pipettes, and we get our pipettes calibrated. We calibrate our pipettes 2 times a year. So we chose the 0.4190% is the highest of the 3 pipettes. So we took the one with the highest percentage accuracy percentage and did that. So this is basically what we're looking at. We then plug this all into a fairly complex statistical formula, and you can see right here is 7.6. So the 7.6 here is our measurement uncertainty, and that percent is what gets multiplied to all of our ethanol values, so you'll be able to get that kind of measurement uncertainty in that range. Let me show you what I'm talking about here. So I kind of just want.
Can you back up real quick? I have a quick question.
Absolutely.
The pipette, you said that you calibrate those twice a year, right?
Yes, yes.
So does that value 0.4190, does that change twice a year?
So basically, we use the one time a year where we pay for an individual to fly out to the lab, and he actually does it. So that's the one that counts for our accreditation because he's ISO certified. The other one is an in-house, and basically we use his sets of guidelines, and as long as the pipette is still performing within those criteria, then that pipette can continue being used for another 6 months. But we use the professional ISO certified calibrator. We use his numbers.
Okay. And the time that he flies out, then these numbers may change slightly each
Absolutely.
year?
Yep,
okay.
Each year. And so I guess I never spoke about this. So our policy is to update our measurement uncertainty yearly. So this isn't updated, we don't have the capabilities with our LIMS system or our data management system to continually update things at all times. So this 7.6% will be our uncertainty until January 1st of 2014. And then
and for lab certification, how often is it required that you update those numbers? Or is there a requirement?
There is not an actual requirement. The requirement is whatever your personal laboratory, whatever we've decided on within the lab, we just have to follow that. Kind of whatever rules we put on ourselves.
Sure. Do you know how Montana compares to other states?
In terms of the 7.6%?
In terms of how often you...
well, I think most people would probably... I know of some labs that do it consistently. Like every time a new QA/QC number gets added to the spreadsheet, it automatically will update that reported uncertainty. But it'd be such a small amount. These are fractions because we've ran well over. You can see the degrees of freedom up here, greater than 100. Anything greater than 100 statistically, there's no difference anymore. And we've got hundreds and hundreds of values in our system already, so it's really not going to change. But some labs do update consistently, but many labs don't.
Okay. Thank you, Scott.
Yep. So there are some things that, at this point we just needed to get this project done and move forward and give this information out. We have not put any real work. There are a few ideas that were being tossed around in terms of trying to lower this percent uncertainty. So get this 7.6% maybe down to 6%, things like that. So we need to potentially, I'm looking at purchasing what's called an automatic pipetter. So everyone would use the same pipetter, and that would certainly narrow it down. If we ever move from having fewer people perform the volatiles, that will decrease it. So things like that. There are ways that we may be able to decrease this number. So I've kind of spoke individually about how we track the total measuring system, and these are our 4 ways that we do that. So we would get a reported value. This example has ethanol at 0.119 plus or minus 0.009 grams per 100 milliliters. And that 0.009 is just 7.6% of the 0.119, our actual value. So how we would interpret this result would be that the true value of ethanol in this case is, like I said, plus or minus that 0.009. So that would be 0.110 to 0.128 grams per 100 mil. So because of our coverage factor, this is just a statistical term, is K equals 2, we would say that we're 95.45% sure that it would fall within this range. Is there any, it's a lot of stats, and it certainly took all of us a little bit of time to kind of get up and running with this, but for the most part I think I don't think it should really hurt prosecution too much, but you guys may have kind of more real-world examples from that. Does anybody have any questions they want to type in or let Aaron know?
I will talk just a little bit. I have not heard challenges in Montana. We've tried to get out in front of this, Scott, you and I, and let everybody know that this is happening. In other states, defense attorneys have done some interesting things with this, but what Scott has said consistently and what the toxicologists say consistently on stand is that the process isn't necessarily different. Now we're just showing more information on the report. Is that right, Scott?
That's exactly it. I think we're certainly don't feel we have anything to hide or be worried about in terms of this range. It is just mathematically people can now just visually see it because we've given that mathematical number to it, where before it was kind of a vague conversation that we would have.
Yeah, and with any luck, it will just run smoothly from here on out.
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly the times that there could be issues is when that 7%, when this range falls, part of it falls below the per se.
Sure.
And that's the obvious. And then it just becomes a conversation of these are the numbers. And I honestly don't know how that works in terms of the law.
Yeah, and I know that Missoula County had one of those challenges where it was very close to the per se, but the individual was charged under a 401, or even, I don't even recall if it was a 401 or a 406 violation that the individual was charged with. And the prosecutor in that case was able to effectively argue that even with it falling below at the time of testing, that at the time of the arrest or at the time of driving, it was most likely higher, and the jury convicted the individual. So I know there are some nuances to arguments for each individual case. And I certainly would not dump a case just because the minus 7% might put you below the per se. So
Yeah.
it just might require you to be a little extra prepared to make some other arguments.
And we're talking, this is probably somewhere between 5 and maybe up to 10% max of the cases we get in terms of those values. All right.
All right.
All right. Well, the last thing, and this is actually, feel free to send me emails or type in. This is more me just curious of what you guys can see. Aaron, can you see this well? Is this clear enough? The report itself?
I can sort of see it. I think somebody who wears glasses might need a little help.
You know what I'm going to do? Well, never mind. I'm going to have to keep going because I can't get it. I have this on my computer, but I will just keep going through this. And if people have any questions, they can just email me. So we are working on the visual formatting of this. I'm not happy with how it looks, but the important thing is what we're giving you increased on this is who performed the actual work. As of now, with a report like this, we could have 4 different signatures on the bottom, but nobody really knows who exactly did what. So what we do is under ethanol, we would put who did this, who did the THC, like the ethanol, maybe Lynn Kurtz would regularly perform that. The THC might be Sarah Brasseth, and the rest of these drugs could be Sarah Hansen Biamonte, for example. But now you'd be able to visually see that, so that should help you people know who to send a subpoena to on what you want to have them to testify about. It could also help, you wouldn't have to make phone calls and you wouldn't have to track us down to figure that out. You just know it right up front. So I think that's positive for you as the attorney.
So for example, Scott, if somebody has a case where it's THC and alcohol and they have a question about marijuana, they might be able to see that they need to call Sarah Brasseth if they have that question.
Exactly.
Everybody's life a little bit easier.
Yeah, exactly. It's one less kind of round of phone calls and emails and things like that. So yes, exactly. You'd be able to call. You'd see that she did it. She did the THC, which since she's the only one that does the THC, that's kind of obvious. It's less obvious when you get down to the other drugs, like say clonazepam in this case, or that you might be interested in. But yes, and we're working on whether these are going to be signatures that are performed by, if they're going to be the signatures on the end, or if it's just going to be kind of a typed name. But what it is secure, and this will be important for people to know, I think, is like, say Lynn Kurtz did the ethanol, him putting his name there, that's a secure process through our system. I couldn't go in and put Lynn's name under that ethanol. I could only put my own name. So it is fairly secure on the computer end of it, which is important for us accreditation-wise. Another thing that's important accreditation-wise that may give you guys limited information but probably not be very important is the method itself is going to be listed. And again, that's more for our administration side. And I think the main question, besides the trying to work on the visual format of this so it's not quite so clunky, is the signatures, on whether, if we can't get the signatures to work there, whether everyone will have signatures at the bottom of the report like it is currently, or if it would just be my signature, because I was doing basically the technical review. So if people have any thoughts on that, I'd be interested in that, just because it doesn't really matter for us. This would be more for what's easier for you, because I clearly don't want to get subpoenaed in all 6,000 of our cases. So we'll have to keep subpoenaing the people that actually do the work, but I will be, feel free to send an email or if you have any thoughts on that.
And would this change, Scott, necessarily affect the process of the crime lab? Does it lengthen or shorten it, or is it just no effect?
No, that's a good question. Actually, the reason why why I'm pushing this through is because this is going to free up a fair amount of administrative time on our end. So we have a person so the way the reports get entered in, it's going to cut out potentially about 15 hours a week, 15 hours of work per week. So it's going to, should smooth the process through, and we should be able to get some reports out as fast as like 5 or so days sooner. So it should help us immensely on the administrative side.
And is that for all blood results, or just, I think that's what you said earlier, right?
Yeah, it just depends. Like I said, the way we have a bottleneck in our system, so sometimes some cases get kind of stuck in that bottleneck and some don't. So this is kind of eliminating one of the bottlenecks in our administrative system. And the second bottleneck that people have, or should shorten it, is some of you may have heard about basically the e-reports that we're working on. There's a system being in place, and it's not quite ready to go live, though we've been doing a lot of kind of beta testing on it, where we will have a portal system, and all of you will be signed up and have your own individual passwords. So for your case, so for example, this case is a Steve Barclay case from Anaconda. He would have his own password, and he would be able to enter into this portal system, because we would have sent him, he would get an email notification that said that he had, say, 2 cases, reports waiting for 2 cases that just got released. He would then go log on to this system with his secure password. He could then download these 2 reports, and only he could see them. And that's how we, in the future, and we're hoping to have this completely go live within the next 6 months, that's how everyone will be getting their reports. So now we don't have to package them up into envelopes and mail them across the state. It'll just be instantaneous.
That's pretty cool. So the law enforcement officer who investigated the case would be able to pull up the report, right? That's
Yes,
what you're saying.
whoever the submitting agent is. So whoever name is in this top left-hand corner, most of the time it's the police force. There's a handful of jurisdictions where it is the actual attorneys.
Okay. And then that individual could print the report and give it to the attorney, or?
Yep, exactly. It's the same way that it currently is, except for instead of us mailing it, these people would just download it.
All right.
So that should, that'll save 3 or so days as well.
And when are you anticipating that would be ready?
I'm hoping we are going to start with the Highway Patrol, Montana Highway Patrol, just because it's kind of a small unified, it's a large group, but it's fairly unified, so we can try and I think we're going to try and get that going with them within like the next 1 or 2 months. We've been working with that, but it's the administrative side of getting everyone their passwords and stuff is the next big step from what I've heard.
Sure.
And then once we work out all the kinks with them, then we will open it up to the whole state. But we will be contacting everyone that has an account with us to let them know that that's how this is going to work. So we'll be pushing this. You guys will know if you need to know.
And I guess if you're doing it that way, does that mean you're going to have electronic signatures on the toxicology report?
They're already electronic.
Oh, they are? Okay.
Yep. Yeah, we don't sign anything. They're already electronic signatures.
Gotcha.
So yes, any ideas? It really comes down to, for this, is should all the analysts be signing at the bottom, which will probably be the case unless we can get it to be signatures. I don't know if you can see where I'm circling, under the performed by. And if we can get their signatures there, that's what we're hoping for. But we may not be able to work out the kinks in terms of the data getting it all put together with the formatting. And that is all I had. Does anybody have any questions?
If anybody wants to be unmuted, I'd be happy to unmute you if you'd like to speak with Scott right now. Just send in a general to an entire audience. Just let me know in the chat. For some reason, I'm not getting the individual ones to open up right now. But I think we'll go ahead. Paul, are you ready to take over? You probably have to unmute.
Yes, I am. I'll go. I got it. Can you hear me all right, Erin?
I sure can.
All right, I'll go ahead and change over to my slide.
And while you're doing that, I'll give everybody a little bit of an introduction to this. The Bull Cumming and Melendez-Diaz cases in the United States Supreme Court over the last few years caused a bit of an uproar in the DUI prosecution community, really in the prosecution community throughout the United States. And I didn't see it really hit Montana for a variety of reasons. One was that our practices were already in line with those cases, so there didn't seem to be much opportunity for a challenge. But for whatever reason, now I'm hearing of a lot of these Melendez-Diaz challenges. And Paul's was a nice one. If you have his brief and if you have the defense challenge, you'll see the defense challenge. It's a pretty well-written one. It captures the essence of the problem nicely. This is actually an NMS Labs case. So in our statutes, we have some things that we can do if it's the crime lab itself who is running the tests. But as many of you know, sometimes our crime lab is unable to test for a particular substance, and so they will send out for tests to NMS Labs. And that's what Paul's case was. He had a sample that was sent to NMS Labs, and so it didn't necessarily fall within the statute with regard to the crime lab in the way that the argument was framed. So Paul got to look at the issue from a little bit different direction. And just a little bit of background so that we don't complicate things. This case is still pending. You had a mistrial just because of basically a snowstorm, right, Paul?
Yeah, that's correct. Snowstorm, and witness who was supposed to testify by video let it snow partway through trial. Unfortunately, they weren't able to make it because of the snow that would not let up.
Yeah. So the case is still pending, but is the issue resolved, right, Paul?
Yeah, the judge ruled on the issue, and we actually have a pretrial conference on Monday, but presumably the judge's rulings will be the same. But I can just talk about the rulings that for the original trial without any issue.
Okay. So with that, if you could go ahead and get going, and we'll listen.
Great. Thanks, Erin. You can see the PowerPoint okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
All right. So I'll start off and just explain a little bit about NMS Labs. This becomes important when we get to the argument because in a nutshell, what we're arguing is that the nature of crime labs is changing. And so it's important to get a good understanding of what NMS Labs is and does and who it serves, in addition to what the individual who actually testified for the state at trial, what the job function of that individual is. We'll talk quickly about just foundational evidentiary requirements, some chain of custody issues, and then address specifically the Confrontation Clause challenge. Well, NMS Labs is a laboratory based out of Pennsylvania. The Montana State Crime Lab does not have the ability to test for certain drugs that may be in an individual's blood. They have indicators that show them that these certain drugs might be in an individual's blood, but then they need to send it off. And that's what happened in this case. The charge was a driving under the influence of drugs charge. So the Montana State Crime Lab sent a blood sample off to NMS Labs. But NMS Labs serves a lot more than just state crime labs. They serve civil practitioners, hospitals, researchers. And they're nationally, on their website, they show all their accreditations, but I listed just a couple of the big ones there, the College of American Pathologists, American Board of Forensic Toxicology, and then the Drug Enforcement Administration. So the point with this is just to say that they're an accredited lab with nationwide clients. They test mostly blood and urine for alcohol, drugs, and other substances. So as I explained earlier, the important point here is that this is a lab that is not just a crime lab. It's a fully accredited lab that serves a variety of clients with a variety of needs. So the individual that I had testify at trial was a toxicologist. So this individual did not actually handle the blood sample that was sent from the Montana State Crime Lab. She reviewed documentation after the testing was actually done, and because she was toxicologist, she had the ability to testify about the effects of the compounds that were found in the individual's blood on that person's ability to operate a motor vehicle, whereas the analysts who actually tested the blood would not have had that ability. Her job duties include reviewing analytical data, forensic casework, and improving validation standards for testing. So really she's doing two kind of separate things. One is reviewing data from cases for clients, and then two, working on the instruments, making sure that there's proper validation standards. She also regularly attends training, including training on the impact of certain substances on individuals and the individual's ability to operate a motor vehicle.
Paul, can I interrupt you just for a second? Ryan McCarty, I see that I think you had a question, but I can't tell what it is. Is there some way you could type in the chat? That would be helpful. Actually, hold on. Ryan, I just Are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I sure can.
Yeah.
Question?
It was for Scott Larson, so we can move on.
Okay. If you could raise your hand one more time, and here, I just muted you so that I wouldn't have the feedback. At the end, if you raise your hand one more time, I'll go back and we'll ask Scott that question. And the hand raising will just remind me I need to talk to you. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Thanks, Aaron. So importantly, the toxicologist at NMS worked as an analyst prior to being hired as a toxicologist. So she was intimately aware of the chain of custody procedures for the blood throughout the time the sample was at NMS, and testified about that at trial. So just as a brief background, I probably should have mentioned at the beginning here, in my response brief, it was a motion in limine that was filed to exclude evidence because we didn't have the author of the toxicology report available for trial. And that was due to the fact that NMS Labs told our office last second this individual had an appointment and was not able to testify. So we were scrambling and got this toxicologist to testify for us. And we provided in the brief, as you can see if you look at, just kind of an extensive offer of proof to the court so that the court could rule prior to the time of trial. So the toxicologist was aware of the chain of custody of the sample and could testify as to the chain of custody and had experience working the job of the analysts who actually handled the screening of the blood and the testing of the blood sample. So the way NMS works, and this is important for understanding the argument that we make at the end that the nature of crime labs is changing, is they have 3 separate analysts who are performing separate duties. So there's not just an individual who is receiving this blood sample, putting an agent in the sample, and then determining whether or not there are substances in it. This is a fully automated procedure where there are multiple moving parts, and we analogize it essentially to a machine, and the nature of the testing is changing. So the first analyst is the one who actually retrieves the blood sample. The second analyst, well, let me back up. The first analyst retrieves the sample and then actually puts that sample into the machine. It injects the agent into the sample that needs to be injected based on the type of testing that's being done. And depending on what drug you're testing for, a different agent will be injected. Then the sample is placed into a machine along with a few other, potentially to dozens of other samples at the same time. All these samples are tested by the machine, the instrument at the same time, and that instrument automatically generates results. So the second analyst then just reviews the data produced by the instrument to make sure all internal protocols of the machine are met. There is no individual who actually authors the report, and that becomes very important when we talk about case law. But there is no actual author. Instead, there's individuals who are following procedures and protocols, and then an instrument is essentially the author of the report that's ultimately generated. And then finally, the third analyst just reviews the work of the first two to make sure that all the procedures were properly followed. Again, this is just summarizing what I said. There's no manual calculation of results. The instrument automatically saves the results, and the report is automatically generated for each individual sample. Aaron, are there any questions at this point about that you have about something I might have missed for how NMS Labs works?
I don't have any. If anybody has a question, I'm looking at both the chat and the raised hand, so just let me know if you have a question, and I will interrupt Paul. Otherwise, go ahead, Paul.
Okay, thank you. So we'll talk briefly about just your traditional foundational requirement that needs to be laid for evidence to be admitted. In this case, because the toxicologist was able to testify as to the complete chain of custody, the toxicologist was not, as defined by Montana law, a custodian of record, but as you can see under Montana rules of evidence, you can just have a qualified witness. And in this case, we laid enough background testimony from the toxicologist that explained that she was a qualified witness to testify about the circumstances or preparation of the report. Additionally, the Montana Supreme Court has specifically held that hospital blood, which is different but analogous, can be admitted if you have a qualified witness lay the foundation. In that case, there was no qualified witness. There was just an affidavit, so the court excluded the hospital report. But I think the court pretty clearly said there that any qualified witness can lay the foundation. So that wasn't really the big fight that we had in this case. Defense certainly argued at this point, but the bigger issue was the confrontation clause. So as Aaron explained, Montana probably didn't have as big a fight as maybe some other states because Montana's long required the author of a lab report to be available to testify at trial. I think kind of the seminal case in Montana was State v. Clark back in 1998. So we've been doing this for a while, but the case that came out, as I'm sure you're all aware, is Crawford v. Washington, and addressed the confrontation clause and requires that the reliability of testimonial evidence be assessed by testing it in the crucible of cross-examination. The Supreme Court is addressing, in a lot of the cases, address kind of the old school crime lab model where, again, there's one individual who would have the ability to potentially provide a fictitious crime lab report, and that's what the confrontation clause is for, is to be able to give defense the opportunity to cross-examine that individual. There's language in Supreme Court cases that says essentially an individual who might be willing to fabricate an affidavit or crime lab report is much less likely to fabricate that evidence if required to testify under oath at trial with the defendant actually confronting that, that lab analyst at that point. So you can decide for yourself whether you think that's true, but that's what the Supreme Court has said. I put that People v. Barbara case, that California case at the bottom of this slide. if you're at all interested in looking up kind of a history of the Confrontation Clause or looking for a good summary of where the law is at right now, that's a great case to look at because some of those cases that Aaron mentioned, Fullcoming and Williams, it provides just a couple paragraph summary of each of those cases. So that's a really good one to take a look at least from a national standpoint of where we're at with the law right now. So the two cases that I kind of focused on in my brief were Fullcoming and Williams. So in Fullcoming, we had an analyst who prepared a toxicology report and was unavailable at trial. It's not really clear what the internal discipline was from the record, but there was some kind of internal discipline, and I think the court certainly considered that. Additionally, the lab report included a certification that the analyst had conducted the test according to certain policies. Well, this certification was testimonial, and the Supreme Court held that the Confrontation Clause was violated because there was no individual who could answer questions under, as the Supreme Court has said, the crucible of cross-examination. We'll talk about the way NMS works in a little bit more detail going forward here in my argument section, but it's important to note that there was an author in this case, and there was an actual certification that that author followed policies, and those were kind of the dispositive points for the court. In Williams, we have a DNA lab report, which is obviously a little different than a blood lab report, but the court honed in on a couple points. There was DNA found, and a crime lab tested that DNA. At that point, I think that the record indicated there was no actual suspect. The suspect was later found, and there was DNA taken from that suspect, and the prosecution wanted to call a witness who could testify at trial, an expert witness comparing those two DNAs. The court held in that case that the lab report was admissible and the Confrontation Clause was not violated for a couple reasons. One, they talked about the fact that there weren't these concerns that you might see in, again, as I've referred to as kind of an old school traditional case of an analyst who is purposely falsifying the report. These lab technicians didn't know what they were really preparing the report for and didn't know whether it would be incriminating. And they also performed the procedures to prepare this report by following specific accepted procedures and protocols. So a couple things that I really focused on in my brief and then in oral argument to the court. One, on the NMS lab report, there is no specific author. The report was automatically generated by an instrument. Now, I didn't make the argument that the lab report was not testimonial. We really didn't get into that nuance of an argument. But the point was that the toxicologist who we called was able to testify as to any errors that may have occurred that the defense wanted to bring up or answer any questions about the procedures and protocols. And the argument that I made was, even though the toxicologist wasn't the one who did the testing, the toxicologist was actually in the best position of anyone to answer cross-examination questions and was in a better position than any of the analysts. Second, pointed out that NMS is not a crime lab, and their blood samples that they get, they don't know what client they're from. The analysts don't know what client it's from or the purpose of the blood sample. So again, there's not the concern for fabrication that might exist in a traditional crime lab setting. The toxicologist testified about the internal protocols and procedures. And then finally, the big picture, I think, takeaway going forward is this idea of a single analyst who uses certain agents in a blood sample to make a determination about what drugs are in the blood sample is an antiquated one. And that really resonated with the judge. In my case, crime labs are changing, and so I think this is only going to be more and more of an issue going forward, and it's certainly something to look at with both the Montana Supreme Court and U.S. Supreme Court. But the idea of having one potential author come and testify, it's just kind of antiquated because instruments are becoming more and more the actual author, so to speak, of the report than the analyst. Obviously, the court denied the defendant's motion, and at trial, we were able to admit the toxicology report based on the toxicologist's testimony, and that's what Aaron referred to, that my direct examination of that toxicologist will be available on the website. Aaron, that's all I have, unless you have specific questions or someone else does.
I don't. I see that our countdown at the top says we only have 1 minute left. We started the timer a little bit early, so if we're asking questions and we get cut off, I apologize. We're just going to keep going. Ryan, I'm unmuting you. I think it was Ryan McCarty. Ryan, were you the one with the question? Ryan, were you the one with the question?
I do have a question. Is Scott still around?
I am.
Hi, Scott. My question is about kind of the margin of error you were talking about. And I understand the point where it's been set at 7.6 and it's plus or minus, and that's how you get the range. But did I hear you correctly when you said that range, that it's a 95% probability that the numbers fit within that range?
Yes, that's the statistical analysis that we used was what's called a K equals 2 coverage factor. Hello? Okay, so I think it's just me now. So yes, that was the coverage factor that forensic toxicology labs were kind of guided to use and told to use through our accreditation body was what's called a K equals 2 coverage factor. And this is just a statistical term that comes out to 95.45%. So that is true. Is there a follow-up with that?
Unmuted.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. I guess the follow-up would be, is that 95%, is that going to be true of any alcohol concentration number? Or true of the range that we're going to get going forward?
Could you repeat that, please?
Unmuted.
Scott?
Yes.
Is that 95% number, is that going to be applicable to all breath test results going forward? Is that
not? So this is only blood alcohol. Just to repeat, this is only blood alcohol. So this has nothing to do with breath.
Okay. Yeah, I misspoke, but that 95% is going to apply to all blood alcohol?
Yes.
Okay. That was my question. Thank you.
Yes.
Sorry about that feedback. I was trying to manage it the best I could. Any other, let me scan everybody. And then it looks like we don't have any other questions. Anybody else want to either type a question, or if you go to the attendees section, you can raise your hand. And of course, if you'd rather not ask a question in general, I included Scott Larson's email, slarson with an O, Larson at mt.gov. And Paul, would you tell everybody your email, please?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll just type it in there, and it's that kind of long, clunky county attorney email that I think most people have. Did you see that there?
I do see it, and I'll leave the session open for a while for anybody who wants to record that.
Aaron, could I? Sorry to interrupt. Could I just? I have I guess a comment off of Paul's. You know, the way that NMS's lab is set up is really not any different than the way that we run in reality. We have multiple people that do multiple touch the assay, and Montana's just, you guys have already set the precedent with the analysts that did the testifying at trials, so there's kind of nothing to kind of pushback on that. But that idea of the way NMS sets up their lab is really the way all tox labs are really set up nowadays.
Yeah, and I did want to do a follow-up. The issue that Paul's dealing with as it's applied to the lab is pretty well settled in all the other states. So if you get that confrontation clause challenge for the lab itself, the argument is similar. It's very, very similar to what Paul's argument was, and it really is well settled throughout the United States. I hope that you don't get those challenges, but like I said, this is the first time in the last 6 months is the first time I've started to hear these kinds of challenges in Montana. And to go one step further, if you get a Melendez-Diaz or confrontation clause challenge for breath test instruments, it just doesn't even apply. So just let me know and I'll walk you through that argument. That's a pretty simple argument. Those are non-testimonial. Most of the foundational work for breath testing is non-testimonial. So one last thing for CLE credit. I am submitting everybody who's participated today. I'll put you on the list for CLE credit. If it doesn't show up on your transcript and you need us to provide you with something, let us know. I think you'll still be able to self-report it. But Barb is doing all the paperwork to get this approved for CLE credit. I don't anticipate any challenges for 1 hour of that. And again, it will be available on the county attorney's website for review if you want to refer back to the materials at all. Paul, Scott, is there anything, any parting words?
No, not for me.
Not for me. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, thank you both, Scott and Paul, for preparing your information and participating today. Thank you everybody else for attending. I will leave the screen up for a little bit longer for anybody who wants to record anybody's email addresses, and all of the presenters are happy to receive phone calls as well. So thanks again for attending, and we'll see you in another couple months at our next webinar.